Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone once again and continue with a brief announcement. Those who will present their posters today, please meet with us at 2 p.m. for preparation. Putting that aside, let us continue with the second invited talk of our conference. Markus Pöchtrager received his PhD from the Department of Vienna in 2006. From 2008 to 2017, he was an assistant professor in linguistics at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, where he also served as the vice chair of the department in 2016 and 2017. As I took my first linguistics class from him, he ignited my passion for linguistics as well. Since 2017, he has been a postdoc lecturer in linguistics at the University of Vienna, and today he will present his studies on phonology or syntax.
Okay, so thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for the nice words of praise at the beginning. I hope I deserve them. I face two problems here. The first problem is I'm in the slot right before lunch. And that's usually where everybody gets cranky and angry and hangry at the same time. So I could bring a coffee break beforehand. The second problem I have is that I'm talking to an audience where I don't know, where there are many people I don't know. And it's always tricky to find a topic that is of interest to people, you know, where some of them might be phonologists, some of them might be syntacticians, and how to bridge the gap. So I've chosen a topic to make sure that everybody's uncomfortable, and that this one, and I have to thank Markus for that one, because when I started working here, one of the first things, you know, after common introductions and everything, one of the first things she said to me is, so you're a phonologist, does that mean you hate syntax? And I still don't quite understand why anybody would think that, because really I love syntax. It goes from the bottom of my heart. I admire it, I look up to it, I think this is a kind of proof of that. I did. Okay. So, okay, I have to make sure that I speak to the microphone. Setting the stage. So what I want to talk about here is a very broad issue, but at the same time, we're going to look at very concrete problems within or having to do with that broader issue. And the broader issue is, to what extent are syntax and phonology different? So yes, I guess we can all agree that they manipulate different objects. So in syntax, you manipulate, for example, morphosyntactic properties. In phonology, you manipulate phonological properties. But are there any properties that span the two domains, or are they completely different? And if you look at the literature, then the discussion goes in both directions. So there are some people saying, no, the two are different, you know, nothing you can learn from one another. And there are others who say, no, there are similarities, and actually there is a lot to be gleaned from studying one, but when you apply it to a study of the other. So you have here, for example, a very famous paper by Pöchtrager and Halle from 89, where they say, no similarities. But then you also, and also the second one by Nederman from Kot. But then there are a couple of schools within phonology who say, well, really, the two disciplines are fundamentally at some level the same thing. And one school, the earlier one, is dependency phonology. The other school that I'm associated with is the School of Government Phonology. And the name government phonology already gives away the kind of influence that syntax had on that theory. And that was a theory created in the early 80s when government was the central notion of syntactic theory. And, you know, that theory not only took over that notion of government, but also other things like the ECP, the projection principle, empty categories, what have you. I can actually look at the slides here. That's very convenient. No, it's too small. Okay. So what do I mean when I say, are there parallels between the two domains? So for example, you could say, well, we have a sentence which is John said Mary liked Jim, and we can worry about where tense on like comes from. And in a way, it's passed on from the tense of the native verb. And you could say, well, really, that's very similar to what we, for example, find in vowel harmony. If you take a Finnish case, or I could also take a Turkish case, of course, in this present context, you have a word like taloa, partitive of the word for house. You have a word like alula, partitive of the word for intellect, where the frontness of the suffix is a property of the quality of Brazilian vowel. So it's just a property being passed into the next one. Likewise, you could say, well, in syntax, we also find cases of transparency. So in a sentence like Mary liked to think Jim admired her, then think is in the infinitive, and any kind of tense feature that comes from the matrix close to the most embedded clause passes through that neutral element. And again, that finds a parallel in vowel harmony, at least in the language like Finnish, where the vowel E, for example, is always neutral, meaning you can stick it in any way, it just doesn't matter. It's as if it wasn't there. Okay? So that's an area where you could say, they look similar, is there something deep to them? Now, the big prize, of course, comes once you go into the notion of hierarchy. So for syntax, I guess there is no denying that we need to speak of hierarchies and so, and for phonology, that's the kind of usually the bone of contention where people don't really agree to what extent we have that. Very often people assume that phonology is completely flat. So if you ever read something like the phonemic transcription of a word, that's a flat representation because it's one symbol after the next, and there is no indication of which things belong together more closely than the others. And of course, as soon as you come to the next step of hierarchy, where you ask, well, we have hierarchy maybe, but do we also have recursion? That's the next thing. Then people really get very well, phonology maybe it has hierarchy, but recursion certainly. Okay. There is a very famous quote by Jackendorf, which I didn't give you here, but he says, for example, it's very clear that even if phonology has hierarchy, there is no such thing as recursion. Okay, well, we shall see. The argument for recursion is in fact in phonology is in fact rather complicated, and I've decided to stay on the safe side here. So I'm not going to touch recursion because I'm already trying to make people feel uncomfortable, so I don't want to push over the edge to this because I'm too close to far. But I will talk about things like hierarchy. And in particular, I'm going to ask, do we need the kind of hierarchy that we have in syntax also in phonology? Or is the kind of hierarchy we have in phonology comparable to the one we find in syntax? Now, one starting point you could say is, well, we know that in language there is hierarchy all over the place. So the null assumption in a way would be to say, well, if we have another domains, then certainly phonology will have to work. So there is a quote by Garcia Bellido, where she says, well, the simplest hypothesis is to assume that everything involves hierarchy. So only present elsewhere, why shouldn't it be present in phonology, unless it is proof that it does not? Okay, so that's we can show that really we don't need. And people like Harry van der Hulst, for example, have been making the same argument for a long time, where he says, well, the hierarchy is really everywhere. I mean, it's not only in grammar, it's also to be tested in other systems of cognition. So clearly it would be really weird if we didn't have phonology. On the other hand, people like Nelemans and Court, so this is an example of people who say phonology and syntax are very different from each other. They remind us of something which I think is well worth keeping in mind, where they say, well, but be careful, hierarchical structures are very powerful. And just because you can use a hierarchy to explain something does not imply that you must use hierarchy. But there might be a simpler explanation for the phenomenon we look at that doesn't have to do with hierarchy. So just because it can be done doesn't mean that it must be done. Of course, I follow, like coming from the country I come from, Austria, I follow people like Reinhold Messner, who once said, white does climb mountains because he can. Okay, so that's a good enough explanation. Okay, so the really interesting question will be, what kind of phenomena do we have in phonology where it's really undeniable that we need to make use of hierarchy? So we don't want to look at things where we can also use hierarchy and something else. But we want to look at things where, unless we use hierarchy, there's really not much we can say, or at least nothing interesting we can say. So the first question will be, well, what does syntax need trees for, or hierarchies for? Well, for example, to express asymmetries, where flat structures simply wouldn't do. So if you think of binding phenomena, if you think of structural ambiguities, it's a type of blue striped suit, which can be one or the other thing in terms of meaning, depending on how it's internally structured, then it's very clear that hierarchical structure is necessary here. The question would be, can you find something comparable? Before we dive into that, I need to get something else out of the way. And that has to do with how you think about phonology in general. So, in syntax, people would usually try to give explanations for why things happen, why they happen. So, for example, you could say a phrase moves in order to get a case, to check a case. You might not like the explanation, but at least there is an attempt to say something happens for a particular reason. You don't just say phrases move around randomly. That would be weird. Okay? And it's kind of interesting to observe that not the same rigor is always applied to phonology, but very often people are happy with this kind of rewrite rule going back to the 50s, really, of the shape A goes to B in the context of C, which basically just says anything can change under any context. And that's not a very scientific explanation of anything. That's writing what you see, but it certainly doesn't give an account of why things are happening the way they are. Now, that's a way of thinking about phonology that still many people adhere to, where they say, oh, well, we'll just write the rule that happens and then we're done with it. That's not the end of it. That's really just the beginning. This is only just describing what you have seen. That is very different in this particular school that I'm affiliated with, that I mentioned before, government phonology, where one of the central assumptions, the kind of defining criterion of the game, is to say, we really want to understand why things happen where they happen. So we don't just want to say this and this happens, we're done, we can go for drinks. No, we try to understand why, for example, a vowel becomes front in a certain context. Why does to go to a certain context and so on. Okay, so we want to have a connection between what happens and where it happens. So that's very easy to see, of course, in a case like vowel harmony, because you can say, well, why is the vowel in the suffix front? Well, because the vowel in the stem is front. Okay, that's a trivial example, but really that's the kind of thing you want to look for everywhere. And again, here, my plan will be to look at phenomena that can not be adequately explained without hierarchy. But my whole argument becomes meaningless, more or less, if you don't share that assumption with me about phonology. So if you think phonology can be anything anyway, then there isn't really much need for looking for explanations or trying to understand why things work, and therefore there also won't be any need for you to say, well, we need hierarchy to explain that. So far, so good. People don't seem too upset yet, so that's good. Okay, I'm moving on. Another thing I need to give you, kind of for this whole thing to make sense, is I need to tell you a little bit about elements. And the good news here is this is very easy to understand. If you have ever attended a kindergarten, and if you've ever maced colors, you will understand how this works. Okay? Now, these elements replace the kind of features you find in other frameworks. So in other frameworks, it's things like plus minus high, plus minus low, plus minus row, what have you, round, what have you. And in this theory, the way it works is there are a number of elements, and we'll focus on three here, the most famous ones, A, E, and U. And they characterize, for example, the qualitative level. So if you have the element E by itself and you pronounce it, it will sound like this, E. If you have the element U by itself and you pronounce it, it will sound like this, U. If you have the element A by itself, three guesses what that will sound like. Ah, okay? So imagine these are colors. Okay, if you have yellow and blue and you mix them, you get green. If you have E and A and you mix them, you get E. If you have if you have U and A and you mix them, you get O, and so on and so forth. So it's really just like colors. Okay, should be very easy to understand. And we're going to look more at these three guys here, these three elements, because I'm going to say, well, it looks as if they are a nice triangle and they all have the same status and we mix them and everything is good. But they're very different in kind. They have their own personality, they have their own nature. The matter of fact, I'm going to argue later that the element R doesn't even exist. Something completely different. Looks like a syntactic structure, but wait for it, okay? You might already see, or you might already suspect certain problems if you look at the arrangement as it is given here. So you could say, well, I know there are many languages that have E. That's a very common vowel to find, and that's a combination of E and R. Now, finding a language with U, a combination of U and E, is not that easy anymore. I mean, we just happen to speak, most of us happen to speak languages that have them, but there are tons of languages which don't have them. Okay, whereas A, very common thing. So what's going on here? Well, we shall see. As I already said, these elements can occur by themselves, or they can occur in combination, and they also occur in consonants. The good thing is we don't really need to talk about that much. So, for example, E will occur in palatal consonants, U will occur in labial consonants, R will occur in coronals. Trust me, we can talk about it later. It doesn't really matter much. What we need to understand outside works for vowels. Okay. Now, we come to the uncomfortable part, because I'm claiming something that should legally be syntaxes, which is the notion of binding. And that leads to the point where syntacticians get very, very unhappy because they go, well, this is ours. Why are you saying this? Okay, what do I mean by that? Okay. Binding phonology has to do with trying to understand this individual nature of the elements that I mentioned. Because they're not just distributed around the world. They have certain properties, and I think by looking at syntax and by looking at a phenomenon like binding, we can make headway to understand what's going on. Languages as diverse as English, Mandarin, and Japanese all suggest that there are very clear asymmetries, at least between the element E and the element U, and that these notions can be understood if we think about them in syntactic terms, in a way to be made clearer as I move on. Crucially, that will only be possible if we think about it in terms of a hierarchy. It won't be possible to think about it just as things next to each other. So the tree structure aren't just convenient for me. It's not just a way to say, haha, I can use latex, haha, I can draw trees. No, no, they fulfill a function. Okay, and we want to begin with a tiny little innocent problem. It's one of those problems where one day I was sitting down and I thought, this should be solvable in 3 hours. Rainy afternoon, I can solve that problem. Here I am, 15 years later, and I'm still not quite sure I understand what's going on. And that has to do with diphthongs in English. Okay? So we have in English diphthongs like boy, okay? And we can pick them apart. And I'm using notions such as core to talk about what's at the center of the diphthong and off-glide, okay? And we can start decomposing them into elements that they consist of. So the O consists of R and U, the E just consists of so far so unspectacular. And we can make a list of the things we find, and this will be these 5 things, okay, at least for most varieties of English. Of course, I mean, speaking of English, if it was one form is a bit dangerous, but let's take British English, for example. Now, we can make things even easier, and we can say, well, just look at the 3 on the left. Because the 2 on the right, like A and O, for one thing, they don't occur in all the varieties of English, right? So if you take Southern British English, you will have them. If you take Northern British English, you won't have them. Okay. At the same time, the reason why I'm really focusing just on the first 3 is once we understand these 3, we also understand the other 2. So we don't really learn much new from the 2 guys on the right. We're just going to focus on the 3. The question will be, why do we have exactly the ones we have? Yeah, that's a very simple question. And as always, the simple questions turn out to be the really tricky ones. So there is an old idea by a British phonologist, John Harris, who says, well, there is a very simple condition, which is a complexity condition. It says you just count the number of elements. And in the core and in the off-glide, you count the elements, and then you have to find that the number is such that the core is at least as complex, means has at least as many elements as the off-glide. Okay, so obviously here we have 2 in the core, we have 1 in the off-glide, everything should be fine. Okay. The problem is, it's very easy to show that this fails. Why? Because English has I, okay, 1 on the left, 1 on the right, 1 is at least as big as 1, we're good, but that should mean I should also be able to flip them around, and I can't do it. Okay, so what's going on here? Or you should find things like ale. You know, oi is good, 2 on the left, 1 on the right. Here I have 2 on the left, 1 on the right, that should be good, but it's not a good diphthong of English. So clearly this condition is not even half of where we want it to be. So the question is, can we solve this? How can we solve this? Okay. The complexity obviously won't give us the answer we need, so we need something else, because the reason why it fails, I think, is because it doesn't take into account the individual nature of these elements. You can't just say, oh, I count them. you need to think about what are the properties of R, what are the properties of E, what are the properties of E. That's what you need to think about. Okay, so let's try the following. Let's say, we just pick a victim here and see how we fare. Let's say the core must contain the element R, the off-glide must not contain the element R. That's a pure stipulation. There's nothing deep about that. Just saying that and see where it takes. Furthermore, I say there won't be anything in English which allows for a combination of E and U. Again, that's a very banal statement because that's basically like saying English doesn't have U's and U's on rounded vowels. Again, we know that. And furthermore, I assume every position has to be filled, like you have to put somebody everywhere. Now, with these three conditions, you can then set out and say, well, what are the logical possibilities and what remains? Now, the good news is, by just making these very basic assumptions, you can cut down the number to the 6 possibilities you find at the bottom of this slide. Now, the two guys on the right, those are the guys where I said they don't offer anything new. They're allowed by the system, but we won't consider them any longer because they're not tell us this. The three guys, I, our, oi, they're also allowed by the system, and that's good news because they do occur. Eu is also allowed by the system, but that's bad news because that doesn't occur. So the system or the account that I've given so far is nearly there, but it's not quite there. And of course, at this point, you could immediately say, okay, well, yeah, I mean, I can make any hypothesis I want, but what's the big deal? So you could say, well, what's so special about R that it needs to be mentioned in particular to refer to big sums? What about the asymmetry between E and U? Which asymmetry do I mean? Well, let's go back one slide and compare oi to eu. So the only thing that is different between the two is where I have E and where I have. If it's in one kind of arrangement, everything is good. If I flip them around, it's bad. Okay, so that's what creates the problem. Okay, the question will be what's bad. Now, in order to explain that, how am I going to time that? Okay. In order to explain that, I need to tell you a bit about the element R. That's one thing I've been struggling with for many years too. R, the element R, is a weird guy. Whichever language you look at, you will find R behaves in a weird fashion. Now, R is the element that roughly corresponds to non-I when you think about vowels, but it also corresponds to the property of coronality. And again, we can substantiate that if I want to go into that here. So that's what this is. And I'm not the first person to notice that R is weird, but I'm the first person to do something about it. So it's like this old joke, everybody talks about the weather, nobody does anything about it. So everybody has been noticing for a long time that R is weird, but no, everybody says, well, it's weird. Okay. When I say it's weird, or when I say it's different, what I mean is it seems to interact with constituent structure in a way that other elements don't. And that's strange. Let me show you examples, what I mean by that. English words usually have a maximum size. So you can have something, or the rhyme of the word, let's say, has a maximum size. So you can have something like a long vowel followed by one consonant, meet, oat, root, or you could have a short one followed by two consonants. That's good. However, as soon as you have two consonants at the end which are coronal means they contain R, they allow for the vowel before them to also be long. So what I mean is you find a word like themed, long vowel, and two consonants which you shouldn't have. But you can only have that if both consonants have a certain property. That certain property means they need to be coronal, which in my in that system means they contain the element R. So that's what I mean. That's what I mean when I say R interacts in a weird fashion with constituents. And you can continue that game for other things in English. I mean, in English, the pattern is actually very complex. What is even more shocking for me is that the pattern isn't just restricted to English. You find exactly the same pattern in an unrelated language like Finnish. Okay, the same story again. Normally you have size restrictions. As soon as you talk about corones, you can go beyond. Well, because they're special. Okay, why? What's the nature of that speciality? So how to encode that? And that's the bit I've been struggling with for a long time. And my guiding principle here was to say, well, if the element interacts with structure, make it structure. It's a bit like this job from computer engineering. If it walks like a duck, if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, then probably it is a duck. Okay? And it's the same thing here. If it looks like structure, if it behaves like structure, then basically it makes people wrong to think about it in terms of an element, but really we need to think about it in terms of structure. And in particular, I will talk about it in terms of empty structure. So everywhere where in the past we thought we have an element R, really what this means is we have loads more structure. And this structure is empty. And this structure can be borrowed from somebody else. So it's a bit like saying you have a big house and you have an empty room. You don't use that room. So you can invite friends. A word like fiend has two coronals at the end. They have all this empty space, all these empty spaces for friends. So the vowel moves in and says, okay, let me belong. Something like that. Okay, that's the image. You don't need to understand the detail as long as the image is clear at this point. Okay. So how exactly does that look like? And here is where all the syntacticians. Okay, I'm going to say the following. Vowels contain two heads, or up to two heads. And I call them X, lowercase n, X, capital N. Any similarities to things in syntax are, of course, completely coincidental. It's nothing to do with little b or big b, just so happens. Okay? And each head can project up to twice in accordance with X-bar theory. And so the maximum you can have is a structure like this. That's a very big vowel. That's a very open vowel. The more open you are, the bigger you're going to be. So let me give you concrete examples. If you're an E, then you're very small. If you're more open, then you're bigger. If you're even more open, then you're even bigger. Okay? And you see there are also these elements E in there. Why is that? Well, because it's still front vowels. I know that this looks very disheartening if you see it the first time. You say, oh my God, big stress, and I've never seen them before. Don't worry. You know, I'm trying to point out the important thing. The important thing is we need to understand there is more structure, and there are these guys which make them front. If you understand that, you're good. I mean, you know, it's like me trying to solve it. Yeah, it's okay, trust me. Yeah? Okay. We can skip that, we can talk about that later anyway. Okay, so with that in mind, how does that help us with the dictons, and how does that help us with finding? Okay, so in the old days, when the element R was still around, we would have said, well, OE is good, and EO is bad. Why? And we would have looked at the elements, and we would have said, well, if I combine R and U to give O, followed by E, everything is good, but if I switch the places of E and U around, it's bad. And I put the I in inverted commas because, you know, I killed it. It's no longer an element, but I use it as a, you know, that's like this tombstone to remind you it was once there. And at this point, I do what I normally do, which is I look to other things. And I look up to the people I really admire, which of course are the syntacticians, and I say, what would syntacticians do? Is there anything in syntax that reminds me of? Well, one thing that reminded me of was binding. But you can say something like John saw Mary, Mary saw John. You can say he saw himself, but himself saw he did that. Okay? I'm going to do the same for phonology. I'm going to say, well, E and U will stand in a certain binding relationship. And I know there are problems with that if you play the comparison to syntax further, but we can look at that later. The binding principle I'm going to suggest is E can bind U, but U cannot bind E. There is a very easy way to remember this. If you read the elements as pronouns. I can bind you, but you can't bind I, me. Okay? You will never forget that. You might forget the rest, but that's the goal. Okay? So that's an easy way of doing it. Okay, so that's the binding condition, and the binding condition restricts the co-occurrence of these two elements. Binding happens on the C command. As a matter of fact, I'm lying here because it's a bit more complicated. C command won't do, but again, trust me. I'm simplifying things. How does that help us with OE and with EO? Okay, well, let's put everything into place. We have at the core the element up. Because we have an O, we have an A, we're comparing. They're both mid vowels. So there needs to be something there that makes them mid. Okay? So there is a certain amount of structure. There is also, and I will now move away from the thing because I don't trust pointers because they never point to where I want them, and I can't see them usually. Okay, so this is the head, rounded make sure that in the end of the day, you get an O. Okay? The off line, that's the little E attached here on the right. Okay, and on the other side, it's the other way around. Okay, I'm moving back to the mic so that people can actually see me. Okay, so once we have that in place, we just need to apply syntax. I mean, not syntax, binding, that's what syntax is. E can bind to O. That means E can C command. That's okay on the left. Everything is good. U cannot find E because you can't find E. There's obstruction on the right. On that. Okay. Right. Now, obviously, that only works if you have a way of making them asymmetrical, because if they both C command one another, then you would exclude them both. Okay, so there needs to be some kind of asymmetry. And we'll skip that, and we'll skip that, and we'll skip that, and we'll skip that, and we'll skip that. It's not so interesting. What's more interesting is an urgent question you might have at this point. The urgent question would be, what's the independence of code? So, yes, I've given you this very convoluted, complicated story for English, but does it give me anything else? I mean, obviously, a theory that only explains one dicton in English isn't correct. Huh? So, do we find these restrictions elsewhere? And do we also find evidence for these asymmetries outside of this complicated story that I told you about the element R? So, can I tease the bits apart so that I say, I just want to look at the asymmetries between D and U, but I don't want to worry about R. And that can be done. And I won't give you the whole story because I won't have time for that, but I will give you part of the story. And that part of the story has to do, you can skip that, and that has to do with Mandarin. Okay? And my claim will be, if you do the same thing you did for English, for Mandarin, you get Mandarin pretty much free. Or at least that one thing, I mean, not all of Mandarin, but that's the phenomenon for free. Okay? Now, it's a bit complicated, and again, please bear with me, because if you look at this chart, the first one, you might say, oh, God, it's so complicated. Okay, there are really only 6 cases we need to look at. Okay? Mandarin is very complicated nuclei, which don't only have off glides, but they also have on glides. So a glide to the right and to the left. So things like yao, for example. Okay? Now, if you look at these 6 representative cases, I've divided them up in such a way that we have everything we need. So you see the first 4 are marked A1 because they illustrate asymmetry number 1. What's asymmetry? Well, you see that in the core of all these dictons, you have to have something that is at least mid or low. You can't have a high bar. Okay, so there needs to be some kind of structure there to make this possible. That's the minimum requirement. To the left, you can have an E or you can have an E. Let's look at the cases under A. So what do we see? We have a kind of A in the middle. That's a front vowel. Why is it front? Because the glide on the left makes it front. The glide on the left is front and it makes it front. Okay, it fronts the vowel. It's not just A because it was always an A, it's an A because it has been fronted by the preceding glide. The same with O. Why is it an O? Because the U is an effect on that. Okay? So the on glide can affect what follows. Look at the cases in P. We have an on glide and we have an off glide, and the two compete. Who wins? It is always the off glide that wins. So if you have both an on glide and an off glide, only the off glide can color code. So you have something like EO, or you have an O vowel because the following guy is rounded, or you have something like way, where you have the E coloring the code. Okay? So asymmetry number 1 is the guy before can color the core unless there is a guy on the right, suggesting that the guy on the right, the off glide, is somehow closer to the head than the on glide is. Okay? So again, we can think about this in hierarchical syntactic. The second asymmetry has to do with a beautiful EU asymmetry, because you can have something like yao, that's good, but if I flip E around, Y won't work. Now let me hasten to add, Mandarin does have the sequence Y if W is an onset and then I is the nucleus. So if the constituent structure is different, you can have that. But you could not have that as a single nucleus. How do I know that? Well, if it's a single nucleus, I can always put, for example, before and get the possible word. So something like Diao is a possible word, Dwai is not. Okay? So it's very, very complicated, but it can be picked apart. So this illustrates the second asymmetry. If you have both E and U, then again the order of the arrangement of the two lengths will be important. Okay? Now, the good news is, once we have English, everything follows. Okay, let's look at the first asymmetry. So why does the off-glide name? Well, it's again, of course, very similar to what we see in syntax. I mean, if you have, for example, a German sentence like "komm mir zuliebe," come on my behalf, then mir, pronoun me, gets case from somewhere. Where does it get case from? From the postposition. Why? Because the postposition is syntactically close. We can't just say, oh, well, to the left we have a verb, and to the right we have a verb. That's silly, right? I want to understand what is closer to what. So case assignment doesn't apply by linear project, it applies by hierarchy. The same is true in phonology. You can't just look at linear equidistance. You really need to think about who is grouped with who, where. Like, how do things group together? Okay, so this is the kind of tree we're going to look at. Again, don't worry about the details. You just need to understand this represents a complex nucleus. It is fairly big because at the center you will always have something that makes it mid or open. And you will have the on-glide to the left, you will have the off-glide to the right. And crucially, not only will you have them to the left or to the right, you will also see the off-glide is much closer to the ultimate head far down than the on-glide. Okay? Once we have that, let me skip ahead. Once we have that, we immediately know why the off-glide always wins, because it's closer to the head. So in a scenario like this, EO, it's the off-glide word which colors the head, making it an O. It couldn't be the on-glide E, because that would be skipping somebody who's closer. It's a kind of relativized minimality. But again, we don't need all the details. If you understand the general idea, that's good enough for this point. If you switch the two around and say, well, what about way? Well, same story. The guy who's closer wins. It's always the same. It's just like in syntax. This we can skip as well. So let's come to the real nice one, the second asymmetry. Because once we have the first asymmetry explained, and once we have English in place, everything else follows. Okay, how? Well, this would be the representation of Yao, which is good. This would be the representation of Y on the right, which is bad. And you can look at this and you just need to check the sigma mark between E and U, and you have your answer. On the left, I can bind you. That's good. On the right, you are trying to bind me. That's it. Okay? So the same structure that we needed to explain first asymmetry, and the same binding principle that we used for a language like English, can also be used to explain something that is, well, completely unrelated. It's still about vowels. Okay, that's a different language and it's a completely different set of things. Okay. And okay. Skip. We can skip that as well. Let me just show you one last thing. Okay, because I think I should leave. It's 15 minutes for questions. All right. Yeah, okay, so I have 2 more minutes. So I'll skip. I had something on Turkish as well, but the good thing is I can tell you that in the break. I don't have to tell you now. But let me tell you about Japanese. Okay. The good thing is these EU asymmetries can be found in pretty much any language. So there is also in Turkish. Just think of vowel harmony. That will be your homework. Okay, to be written out and submitted next. No, sorry, I don't work. Okay. What was I going to say? So these EU asymmetries you find pretty much everywhere. So you should have the chance to submit this to a very major scrutiny and say, well, there is another language. Let me look at how that looks. Okay. So I think that's, for example, also for Japanese. Now, Japanese has sequences of glides plus vowels. So it's a bit easier again because you don't have to worry about 3 things. You just need to worry about the on-glide and the core. Okay. Now, if you look at this, people usually tell you there is a y series and there is a w series. So there is ya, yo, yu. There is no yi, there is no ye. And then if you move to the w series, there is only one. Okay. Now, at this point, of course, it gets exciting. You can say, well, what's the difference between a y and a w? Well, y is palatal, it contains e. W is labial, it contains u. A As soon as I switch the two around, I find that with E, the U series, I'm much freer than I am with the W series. Well, what do we need to do? All we need to do is say two things. On the one hand, we need to say there is no self-binding. So that means no element can bind itself. As a matter of fact, we also need to say that it's Mandarin and Frankish, but I skipped that, so that's a very general thing. And then I just need to say what binding happens as it does in ancient Mandarin. How does that work? Well, in the case of the E, that would be out because that would be an element binding itself. First structure. That doesn't happen. Why is U okay? Because I bind you on the sigma. Why is something like out in Japanese? Because that would mean you bind me, and that doesn't happen. Okay? Now, in the interest of time, I skipped the whole bit about Balamame, and I promise I can tell you, I can tell you in the break if you so want. So, the conclusion is very short. What I think this suggests is that hierarchy and recursion by extension, that we talk about that, they're not just useful things to play around with for us phonologists, but they're actually necessary, because otherwise I couldn't explain these asymmetries that I find. I also think it shows that, I mean, that sounds as if I was preaching the gospel here, which I really am not, but I really think one discipline can learn a lot from the other. We phonologists talk to the syntacticians, there is a lot to be learned, and the other way around, but that not be forgotten. In other words, the machinery used by syntax and phonology might not be so different after all, because I think there are pretty clear parallels between the two, and I think the title is therefore not completely misleading, but as a matter of fact reveals something people need to know about these two areas. Thank you very much. Now everybody's shocked.
Thank you for the provocative talk.
Always.
Take it some, because I was
Always.
one of your students.
I know.
So, why is this binding wrong? Why is it binding? That's number one.
Yeah.
Why does it look? What do you think it's binding, but not say agreement or something else?
But not what?
Agreement. And then the other thing is that, yes, we do know anaphors exist in languages and so on and so forth. Why E and O seem to be so universal, whereas anaphors in general don't seem to be as universal as you would expect to like this, right? So why can't some languages pick, for example, the E to be the anaphor and the U to be a binder? It looks like there's something, we're losing arbitrariness to a certain degree, right? So,
yes. So both of them are great questions and they're difficult questions. So I won't be able to do them justice, but let me try nonetheless. So the first one was, what was the first one? Yes, why, okay. That's me trying, that might, well, okay, if you have a better term to suggest, yeah, then I'm all game. So people, syntacticians have suggested other terms as well, but, there are certain parallels, like for example, this is restricted by domain also. So you can't just say, it wouldn't be enough, for example, to just talk about sigmund, because that would mean you would sigmund everybody down the tree, and that doesn't seem to happen. So it's not like, once you've decided up here, then everybody else is decided for. So in that sense, there are certain parallels, but if you have a better parallel in syntax that matches it better, then I'm happy to. I do know about the problem with agreement, because binding, of course, ultimately has something to do about how we interpret a sentence. It's questionable, or a structure. It's questionable to what extent that implies here. Okay, so here I'm very open to suggestions of how to improve that. As for the second question, why does no language pick that? Again, that's a tricky question. So in this whole program, we looked at other, I mean, it's not just me working on this, but other people as well. We looked at other parallels that we thought we could find between syntax and phonology. And for everything we found is, it always seems to be that phonology seems to be the simpler version. It's as if you want to say you have RNA and you have DNA, and the one is kind of the prototype for the other. Or, I mean, that now sounds like me suggesting that phonology was the basis for syntax, which some people have suggested. I don't want to suggest that. But it always seems to be that it's much, you deal with fewer unknowns in phonology than you do with in syntax. It begins with the set of elements. So I've given you 3 of them, okay? Some people assume there are 3 more. So the maximum number that people these days assume is something like 6. I think that's even too high. I mean, E, R, the element R, I don't think is an element. I have doubts about other elements as well. So I'm down to 3. Show me any syntactic account you can make work where you say, oh, I only have 3 objects to play around with. So given that you have so few things to begin with, it might well be derivable that there is no variation there, because you're playing with such tiny things anyway. What would you even want to vary? There are certain cases, let me just add that, there are certain cases where that seems to run into trouble. So for example, and that speaks to your question, but could it be the other way around? So take, for example, Japanese, which is out. Now, of course, if binding is a universal, then I'm kind of making the implicit claim it should always be out. But there are languages like French, right, which have we. And they don't have the reverse. But much depends, of course, on how you analyze the internal structure of the French we. I mean, just like in syntax. So it might be a problem, and I've been trying to solve these kind of light diphthongs in French, but they're not exactly trivial, surprisingly difficult.
Other questions?
Hi, Markus, thank you for the talk. So you mentioned that you disallow self-binding, right? So was it like English a case where you had on the right part of the or
yes and no? I see what you mean. No, I know. Okay. Oh. Actually, I can. Do I need to go all the way to English? No, I don't even need to go all the way to English. So look at this. You have ye in Mandarin. Okay? Now, why is that not an instance of self-binding? Because you could say, well, we have an e that contains the element e, we have an e that contains the element e. So isn't that a kind of self-binding? But no, it isn't, because here the assumption is, and there are ways of teasing that out, that underlying this is really a kind of schwa. And only by the E element moving in or spreading into that position do you get A as a result. So it wouldn't be 2 instances of the same thing, whereas for Japanese, there is no schwa. For Mandarin, it's very easy to show because you can get the schwa by itself. So the word for hungry at this time of the day is ugh, right? That's just schwa by itself. Beautiful. You don't have that in Mandarin, so that would be one thing.
So it looked to me that when you talked about English, you always have an element that first, right? And I wonder whether this is necessary, because if it's not, what would you say about quit, where you have the UE?
In quit, that I would analyze as a labial of quit followed by it. So a test for that would be, for example, that quit should be able to be followed by pretty much anything, and it is. So you can have quit, you can have quarry, you can have quasi, you can have
Twitter?
Yes, okay. Twitter I would take as a branching concept, probably in the same vein as I would take Trura. So word I would take as a branching concept like Trura. So tree would be like tweet. Now again, if it's a branching concept, really a lot rests on what the arguments are for the internal constituency. Does that address the question?
Yeah, I have another question.
Can I just add something to that? Because the interesting thing is, what we know about concepts versus nuclei is that they're usually very independent of each other.
Yeah,
So then, of course, it's not surprising that anything goes against. Sorry.
The other question was, how about head parameters?
Yes, I have no idea. I really don't know. Again, it might well turn out that there is no such thing. So, for all I know, if you look at systems which have on-glides and off-glides, it always seems to be the way that the off-glide sits closer to the head than the on-glide does, which would be like saying, well, the complement is always to the right, the specifier is always to the left. You don't really have that option of variability. To my knowledge, nobody has really, there are other people who
I
try
was
to.
thinking about French we.
Huh?
Maybe in French you have the head parameter.
But it would be weird because nothing else in French suggests that the head in the nucleus is on the right. I could say that, and then I would immediately be saved for the we problem, but I would be in trouble for anything else in French. So I think it was moved.
Sometimes the VP has a head parameter and the VP has another head parameter. So you divide your domains, maybe you're safe.
That might be true, but that, of course, would depend on how good my argument is for that. And at the moment, it's not very good. So, but I'll think about that. Thank you.
Two questions instead of one, and we can continue during the next. One is about your presentation on the path element. So you're saying it's essentially empty structure.
That's right.
I was wondering, how would you represent cases? So it's easy to find cases for a simulation of pathization, okay, a simulation of E, localization, simulation of O. We also find cases of, for example, monoharmony, lowering harmony.
Yes.
So if R is actually empty, what's spreading?
So yeah, that's an interesting one where I changed my mind several times in the course of a couple of years. Here is what I think now. So in the past, I would have argued it's structure, and structure cannot be moved. So I would predict there should not be anything like, for example, lowering harmony. But I know very well that there is, and that I cannot argue the way. As a matter of fact, I'm currently working on a case in Yoruba where you have that kind of harmony. I mean, it's an ATR harmony, but it's essentially lowering harmony. And there, what you would need to say is that the structure is cold. I'm not very happy about that, but you would need to say something like, if it would be a bit like saying if one kind of phrase has a specifier, then the other phrase that it dominates or that it stands in a certain relationship with also needs to have that specifier. Now that's a bit weird, and the only, or at least from my understanding, it's a bit weird. The only reference I've been able to find is an old paper by Georges Vergniaud, where he talks about what he calls it the Archimedes principle in syntax, and where he says the shape of the size or the presence of a specifier in one phrase has an effect on whether you need to have a specifier in the other. That's a very weak link, but at this point, that's really the only thing I can say. Either I say there is no lowering harmony, but that would be empirically highly problematical, or I bite the bullet and I say structure gets copied. None of that makes me entirely happy, but I'll try to do that.
I'll ask
more specifically about the Mandarin data. You said the offline is more multiple is collected in the center than the online. I don't know anything about the front tactics of Mandarin, but could we just close the online is part of the answer kind of
No, that's the crucial thing. So it's not so. Thank God.
so it's not
No. So it's so. Let's go back to this. That's a very relevant question. So these 6 cases were picked because those are the 6 cases where I'm absolutely sure about the constituency. And I'm sure that all these guys have to be in the nucleus. Why do I know that? Because all these 6 guys can be preceded by a consonant, which is in the onset, which is testable in the onset. Now, Mandarin only allows you 1 consonant in the onset, so then it will follow the exam.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
So the structures you're proposing are for the nucleus, right?
No, as a matter of fact, they extend to other objects in phonology as well.
As well.
Mhm.
So I mean, you mentioned recursion, so I'm really curious about how you can embed
Yes.
one structure into.
Yes. Okay. Okay, I'll give you a quick and dirty answer. It consists of 2 parts. The first part is if you follow mainstream assumptions about how phonology is organized, you have syllables, you have segments, you have the foot, then it would be weird to say a syllable is embedded inside another syllable. What would that even mean? I mean, people have tried that, but it would be kind of weird. Notice the weirdness rests on the assumption that these are the right concepts to think about. And the syllable in particular has been called into question a million times, to the extent that people say, well, you know, the syllable is something everybody uses, but nobody can define. Think of English, and there's a funny distributional pattern, for example, of age. Where can you find age? Now, you cannot say just you always find it in the onset. That would be true for a word like hunger, saying that where it is in the onset, but it can only be in the onset of the beginning of the word. It cannot be in the onset in the middle of the word, so you can't have it intercalary. Now, assume that a word like hunger, 2 syllables, is really structured such that you have one big structure, and in that bigger structure, embedded, you have the unstressed syllable. What would that mean? Your initial cut would be between H and everybody else. So why would H be special? Because it sits in a particular position. Why could you rhyme hunger with happy with? Now I can't think of rhymes, okay? But rhymes usually work the way that you take exactly this break. And that is a break which from a phonological point of view is extremely weird, because if you say it's a foot, then you need to cut the foot in such a way that you say, I take away the first onset of the foot, and that maybe is a constituent, but then everything else which isn't a constituent is the bit that rhymes. Whereas if you say, no, it's the unstressable embedded inside a bigger structure, and hunger really looks like I said that he eats, for example, then you have a special position for the bit that stays the same, you have a special position for where H occurs, and so on. Thank you. Taking a founder.
Hello, so I'm pretty new to this element and urban phonology theory. So, what's the difference between R and schwa?
What's the difference between R and schwa is the difference in size. So think of it in the following way. We'll take Turkish. Turkish is I. What is I? I is really just nothing, but it's a very small nothing. What is schwa? Schwa is a big nothing, more empty structure. What is R? Even more empty structure. So as a matter of fact, I anticipated your question. No, I didn't really, I'm just extremely lucky. No, oh no, I deleted it. Oh, damn. Okay, here we have these three, okay? Take the trees you see here. They're all empty in the sense that none of the positions has any elements attached to them, okay? Is the smallest one. Schwa is even bigger. Is even bigger. And you can show that, for example, in cases of vowel reduction. So what is vowel reduction? For example, you take an you take away the stress, and it shrinks down to schwa. There is an easy way of doing that. You just say, what we lose is structure. Take Turkish. In Turkish, you can say kalacak. You can say kalacak. A goes to U. What happens? You reduce an unstressed position, you lose structure.
Thank you. Hello, thanks for your talk.
Thank you.
The thing I wondered is, at the conclusion stage, you mentioned that phonology and syntax might have similar mechanisms, although they operate on different structures. So, does your model have anything that is not explained by this, that cannot explain because of this disparity, and how can different models like neurosyntax can account for that?
I think what was the second half of the question?
You said that there's a disparity, there can be a disparity between the structures that syntax and phonology operates on. And I think this can cause some problems for a model, but I don't know if there is any. And I don't know how familiar you are with neurosyntax as well. But I just wondered how different models like neurosyntax can improve this model.
So one area of difference, for example, where I really don't know if you can map one to the other, would be the question about head parameters. So to the extent that head parameters exist in syntax, depends on who you follow, of course, that's something where I really am not sure if that applies to phonology. So if you take a branching onset in a language like English, but also in an unrelated language like Thai, the head is always on the left. The head is always on the left. The complement is always on the right. You never find the reverse. If it's the reverse, it's a different structure. If you have the reverse sequence of things, it's a completely different structure. So that would be something where I really don't know if they exist in those domains. So that would be one example of that. To what extent nanosyntax can help? Well, in a way, one source of inspiration certainly has been nanosyntax, because the idea there as well is to say we pick things apart. Now, in a way that's comparable to this, because what I'm saying is in the past we used to think there is the vowel R, and that takes up one position, and then we worry about what sits in that position, a property that makes it low, a property that makes it non-front, whatever you want to say. What I now say, or what I'm saying here, is rather that no, there is an intricate structure hidden inside that, where the individual positions have roles to play. And that's, of course, very similar to what nanosyntax would report. So in that sense, that is a very important source of inspiration for me personally, but of course that doesn't speak to the quality of the model. That might just be me looking at things and saying, it looks great, but what do I know? Thank you.
Any other questions? Then thank you, Mark.
Thank you so
for
much.
this presentation.
I have an announcement to make. Okay, so here is now the car salesman. I am on the board of GLOW, Generative Linguistics it used to be called Generative Linguistics in the Old World, but we've now rebranded ourselves. It's now Generative Linguistics of Our World. That was my idea. Very proud of that, don't look. And if you want to become a member, we have very reasonable rates at the moment, in particular for students. If you're a student and you want to join for 5 years, it will only cost you €5 per year. For faculty, it's a bit more expensive, not much, but a bit more expensive. But, you know, you can always talk to me and there might be ways of making that work. So if you want to join, do join. We offer conferences, we offer online talks, we offer summer schools, we offer all sorts of things. We have a webpage, but you will find out about it. So, okay. And buy my tomato soup. Okay.
Have a lunch break right now.